very much, Robert and Jack, for the invitation. At the first of 3 conferences in Paris, I discussed and emphasized the technique of drilling as a generally disregarded yet quite special form of the reception of antiquity. Drilling enabled sculptors of the 11th and 12th centuries to provide their works with a genuinely antique character. I particularly focused on the use of the drill for the production of eyes in figurative sculpture, as this nice creature behind me by the Cabestano Meister shows, with which I ended in Paris. Quite astonishingly, and especially because of their little geographical distance, we observed fundamental differences between the southwest of France and northern Spain. The idea and reception of an antique sarcophagus from the 2nd century, which shows similarly drilled eyes, gave evidence to this observation. At the same time, I also speak on the backdrop of the Burke Ambrose's Paris paper, Medium as Message, Mixtures on Monster Capital at Westlake. Today's paper considers the influence of late antique and Carolingian drilled sculpture on later works, especially on some capitals from around 1100. First chapter, the drilled whale Ketis of Jonah. 2 fluted pilasters frame the front side of a marble sarcophagus from late antiquity. They flank several scenes in low relief. Stretching from the left foreground to the background on the right, they simultaneously depict the escape of the involuntary prophet Jonah in a vessel, from which he is thrown into the sea. And finally, Jonah, now significantly larger than in the other 2 scenes, at rest under an arcade of pumpkin leaves in the background. Our interest will concentrate on the biblical Ketis, the sea monster that Martin Luther's more innocent translation turned into a whale. We see it in the left foreground, where it approaches the vessel in order to swallow the prophet, while in a kind of heraldic juxtaposition on the right, it disgorges Jonah again after 3 days. The typological similarity to Christ's resurrection is self-evident. He disgorges him. It is also very striking that 3 areas of the relief are particularly defined by a stronger use of the drill. They all grapple with the haptic depiction of hair. The long and woolly fur of the ram in the upper left corner, for instance, is the result of a running drill. That means several holes were drilled in line, and the running drill thereafter removed the remaining sections between the holes in order to achieve the effect of singling out strings of hair, the characteristic modulation of the animal's fur. Another example are the 3 naked putter on the vessel. Each putter's headdress is drilled to the same very heavy and sponge-like effect. The similarity is repeated in the parallel direction of the body movements towards the right. The parallel turn of gazes to the left and the equally parallel position of their right arms, which rise as if to pull something down in the next moment. Apart from the drilled fur and hair, we also observe the extraordinarily drilled modulation in Ketis' mane. Throughout the centuries, the sea monster has traditionally been represented as a hybrid of a griffin-like lion with a mane, a double-wound serpent's body, and a vegetal fork-tailed fin. Here you see the drill holes at the mane. The look and feel of the monster's mane is almost always in antiquity emphasized by the drill, even to the extent that drilled holes transform Ketis' backline into reptile-like scales that can usually be seen on crocodiles. And another Jonah sarcophagus from the British Museum again shows similar holes here in Ketis, his eyes and the teeth, the mane again. The argument presented in this paper will show that the strikingly drilled and thus formally, that means artistically, extremely interesting dragon Ketis of the described Jonah sarcophagus survived the end of the tautological relation between Christ and Jonah which lost its impact in later medieval image production. We will follow the survival from the marble sarcophagus to an ivory relief and further to a relief in stone. Thus, and based on a single example of the whale Ketus, I will demonstrate that the antique technique of drilling continued from late antiquity to the high Middle Ages by means of changing the material and medium. Second, the drilled whale Ketus of Okeanos. A Carolingian ivory relief from around 870, today in the Victorian Albert Museum in London, still poses more questions than it gives answers. The relief's entire surface is equally dotted with accurately drilled holes, which were originally filled with gold, as some remaining pieces of gold filling reveal, especially in the figure of synagogue and in the two houses of the four people risen from the dead. Christ's body shows the holy wounds as drilled holes in the anatomically correct places. Even the three holes in the halo may reasonably be interpreted as a second flame that shines like gold. However, the illuminated nipples, the drilled holes that cover Christ's beard and hair, and the holes we see along the waistcloth, two of them prominently positioned along the knot that keeps the waistcloth in place, but could also be easily opened, that's for Lee Steinberg, all appear very confusing. Ketus is evidently the one figure of the relief that is nearly entirely covered with holes. Okeanos rides on him, holding him all towards the crossed Christ, as if to intimidate him. Ketus is again a pasticcio. He isn't a hippocampus, as the V&A catalog says, because he lacks any elements of the horse, and he's the monster from the Jonah sacrifices. And he's a pasticcio because we see a wolfish head with a fuzzy mane vertically stretched to the top, the front fins are symmetrically scaled, and the remaining body winds like a serpent, finally ending in a feathered trilobite leaf. Just imagine the original filling of this Ketus with no less than 45 golden inlays. Compared to the rather modest decoration of Christ, its dazzling appearance must have struck the viewer's attention immediately. In contrast, terraced up the view, the snake winding around her arm only has 8 holes for gold fillings. Either the author of the hybrid Ketus followed an antique example like the Nereid on Ketus from the lid of a silver pyxis found at Canossa in Puglia in southern Italy around 130 after the death of Christ, or he followed the 9 appearances of Ketus in the Old Testament, which describe the creature either as serpent, crocodile, dragon, or as whale-like Leviathan, or even as a hybrid creature drawing from all of the above-mentioned animals. Technically spoken, the drill is the only device with which the ivory artist would create such a refined surface, evenly dotted and each hole having the same minimal diameter. Even the sharpest cutting tools would fray the soft organic material as ivory, and consequently the gold fillings would barely hold. The Carolingians excessively drilled in their ivories, almost always along the frame, using ornamental forms like acanthus leaves, and also into their figures, certainly for more than just the eyes. This unrestrained drilling already existed in the 6th century, particularly in the case of pyxides. Hence, the Carolingian Renaissance drew immediately from antique precursors, with the consequence that the pragmatic technical solution of craftsmanship and its resulting form became one unit. Third, chaotic drill patterns, drilling for the sake of the drill. Observing the 6th century fixes today in Vienna Kunsthistorisches Museum, the apparently accidental accumulation of holes gives the impression of subsequent damage by a kind of ivory bullet. Yet all holes are indeed intentional, as Mary's and the bull's drilled eyes in the scene of Christ's birth demonstrate. The same holes appear in a quite chaotic and fractal-like pattern on the child's drapery and on the grip's face. Here are the holes, and then again here on the frame of the side. These drilled holes quite evidently did not serve as fixtures to fasten other elements. On the contrary, they were a purely visual element, as the indentations in the bull's lifted hoof show. The holes further dissolved the surface of the pyxis, which was already by nature highly animated by its round shape, especially here with drills in the surface of the pyxis. 4. Aesthetics or astrology. Until today, we do not know much about these excessive drills from Carolingian times. Two explanations seem reasonable. The first refers to an astonishing effect. The precious material, ivory, is combined with an equally valuable material, gold. And because the gilding of entire bodies was uncommon for ivory reliefs, the carver decided for the drilled holes as an alternative idea. Like twinkling stars, the gold fillings cover the white ivory relief, and, maybe as part of the book cover, placed on an altar and illuminated by a few flickering candles, they refract the light in manifold ways. Without further explanation, this refers to the two main materials of the Bible's most important liturgical element, apart from the Ark of the Covenant, that is, the throne of Solomon, made of ivory and gold. Yet, since the relief's drilled holes appear perfectly shaped, equally round and deep, as if they were of divine perfection, an effect impossible to achieve with the common technical tools, relief could easily evoke another impression. Its wondrously penetrated surface is not authored by the human hand, and is indeed an archival python, and thus of heavenly origin. The material combination of ivory and gold at first glance appears to have served aesthetic needs that determine the visual perception of the work, reception. Pushing the argument even further, however, one may contend that it was in fact a necessary means of legitimization. Despite the Libri Carolingi, which allowed a much more unrestrained use of images, as in Byzantium, images, and especially images of such precious materials as ivory, still were an issue of debate in a time where the iconoclastic controversy actively reverberated. Divine provenance of the luxurious ivory gold relief would make the work impalpable for theologians. Yet this explanation is not entirely convincing, because even partial building would have facilitated the powerful and compelling interaction of both materials, and would thus have pointed to the reference of the Sedis Salomonis. Consequently, the impression of a constellation of stars supports a second and equally important argument. Comparing this image of constellations, present in the image with contemporary astronomical manuscripts, most of all the frequently copied phenomena by the writers of Soli, here in the 9th century copy on the left side, it becomes evident that not so much the correct amount of stars, but rather the contouring and animation of celestial bodies by means of personification was a major interest. Here's the Ketis with the trilobite the snake tail and flames coming out of his mouth. That means he's dragging as well. Moreover, the constellation for Ketis presents a hybrid creature of a serpent's tail. Similar to our Ketis from the Ivory relief, it holds numerous stars at the end of the tail. On the back. The Ketis constellation gains its importance from the fact that Ketis was the sea monster from which Perseus rescued Andromeda. In a late 10th century copy of Aratus of Sylvi's Phenomena, produced at the Benedictine Abbey of Cluny, the Latin text says, Cetus counts to the ram, this time the ram, and to the fish. His tail is marked by stars. On his tail he has 6 stars, and his belly again 6. 2 on the fin, this makes 14 altogether. Here is 6, and I have 6 and 2. In the case of folio 26 verso of MS Post Lat Q79 in the Universität Leiden, the artist used gold leaf to decorate Cephalus, who we see with both his arms stretched out like the crucified Jesus. Interestingly enough, the dots are not all located within the outline of the mythological figure. One perfectly round star is clearly outside the contour of his right arm, and other angular stars, especially this one, the 2 on the shoes, are equally transgressing the outline in a peculiar way. To summarize the thesis, it is very likely that the drilled holes which so particularly determine Cetus's appearance on the Ivory relief refer to a constellation. Depictions of the Cetus whale did exist around 1100, and in addition, drilled holes were a site of fascination. Because of its hybrid appearance, the Cetus could easily become a dragon in other depictions. 8 capitals at Transatlantic provide us with one such example of a Cetus dragon with drilled holes in stone. 5th and last chapter, Toulouse, letting the dragon fly. Looking at one of these 8 dragon snakes, and in Greek, drago refers to both creatures, snake and dragon. In Saint-Saëns de Toulouse, which we see here, we witness a twofold metamorphosis. The Cetus changes the winding shape of its body from one capital to the next, and additionally it shifts its state of being from a sea to a land creature, whose drilled serpent's tail rests on the very same ground on which it fights ancients and humans. This metamorphosis is indeed part of the abilities of a Cetus, who, due to the nature of its tail, can move easily in water and on air. The invasion of the griffin-like creatures in Saint-Saëns de Toulouse culminates with 2 archangels that clearly stem from Gallienus' workshop, which becomes most apparent in the decoration of their wings with the typical shingle-covered appearance. Instead of ramming their spears into the open gorge of simple windworms, the fight against the Cetus, whose body is elaborately divided into 3 different surface structures. Lozenge-shaped scales cover the other part. The snake body carries fluted indentions similar to fish bones. And finally, the smooth tail with a second snake head at its end shows small drilled holes. Here these perfect holes on the end of the body. The aesthetic effect, however, was entirely different. All stone capitals in Toulouse were originally painted in strong and loud coloration. The drilled holes, however, produced dark spots on the otherwise bright surface, grey zones, so to speak, that trigger a play of light and shadow. This oscillating effect between light and dark does not necessarily elevate the dragon into the celestial spheres, as in the case of the Ivory relief, but instead animates the figure. The cold and inanimate stone is not visible at all, but only vivid and painted surfaces, scales, feathers, lozenges, and other ornamental elements, all of which animate the mysterious creature in its movements of battle against the archangel or human being. Mysterious also because the Cetus dragons of Toulouse all rest on tails. And the next one shows again these tail holes, and this is the one with the rests of color, especially red, and the only one with only stipulated holes. And all these treatises end with a trilobed leaf, a feature we are familiar with from antique examples, but that for the medieval viewer must have appeared quite separate. Against the ancients. The lower part of the body is entirely covered with drill holes, heavily fluted feathers that furrow into volutes define wings. Lozenges define the elongated neck, and even the pointed ears carry deep drills. Conclusion. As we saw, the return to the drill in Saint-Saëns at around 1100 creates an antique atmosphere. It resembles the drilled sarcophagi from late antiquity that were present at the Port de Caen here. And such accurately drilled surfaces were obviously impossible with the technical equipment of the time. This gives us a chance to focus on the reception of antiquity by means of artistic technique, which until today has remained unregarded by art historical scholarship. Indeed, the drill, some of these antique drills, which were used in the 11th century, you see here, the drill was never forgotten. It simply changed the medium in order to create astonishing and until then quite unfamiliar effects in ivory reliefs of the 8th and 9th century. Since the 11th and 12th centuries consider the period of Charlemagne as part of the antique past, the particular technique of Carolingian ivory drilling was probably also received as an antique technique. The case of Toulouse shows that even if there should have been a total absence of drilled ivory, we haven't any sources of Carolingian ivories now, antique knowledge of constellations, as it was handed down via manuscripts, particularly the phenomena, could become the subject of reception. And the example would be San Isidoro de Leon in Spain, where we have on the Puerta del Cordero, the lamp portal, the south porch, these 12 marble plates from reused antique marble with the Seviercus, one of which shows here the Capricorn with these stars here, all the severities of these dots, meaning the constellations. The present dragon motif gives proof to an uninterrupted chain of reception from antiquity to the High Middle Ages that moved through materials, marble, ivory and stone, and medium, figurative, sarcophagus decoration, reliefs, and the sculpture of capitals. Thank you very much.